This episode of Off the Shelf is brought to us by Busy Bee Vegan Skincare. Busy Bee is an all-natural skincare line dedicated to healthy, vegan, plant-based skincare and overall wellness. They offer a selection of handcrafted body scrubs, butters, and washes that not only make your skin glow but smell amazing. Their unique all-natural scents include gingerbread, ruby grapefruit, caramel cake, and morning latte. So why not treat your skin to something fresh and all-natural? Head on over to shopbusybeevegan.com today. And as a special bonus, Busy Bee is offering listeners of this podcast a 15% discount on your first order with the code OrdinaryPodcasts. Thanks for listening and enjoy this week's episode of Off the Shelf. Hello everyone, welcome back to Off the Shelf, the podcast where we take books off of our shelves and into our hearts. My name is Julia, and I hope that whatever this month threw your way, work, back to school, time with family and friends, responsibilities, disappointment about the end of summer, and excitement about the start of the fall, that you had the strength and the support you needed to weather it well and to look forward to tomorrow. Today on the menu is our final review and dish session on Deborah Baker's Over the Woodward Wall, and I want to start us off just with a single word: preposterous. This book was not what I'd expected, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I've read a lot of more modern fantasy novels, those written in, say, the last 20 or 30 years, and sometimes I feel at this point like my sense of disbelief is just continually suspended. Sometimes I start to believe that fantasy stories can't be too out there, too implausible for me to get on board with. But even still, Over the Woodward Wall surprised me in a lot of ways. I was still on board with it, but it was a different experience altogether. It has so little in common with this modern brand of the fantastic, and everything I've gotten used to expecting from the genre was thrown off its balance a little bit. Before I get too into that though, I'll backtrack a little as I have before, and start us off with a bit of background information about the story's narrative and plot, the characters, and the overarching themes. After that, we'll go a little more into detail and think about why this book feels so different, or at least I'll explain why it felt different to me, and you can agree or disagree, and how Baker achieved this so seamlessly. Also, just as a reminder, Deborah Baker is a pseudonym for Shauna Maguire, so if I slip up at some point and call her by Maguire, or if I don't slip up and I just start calling her Maguire on purpose, don't be alarmed or confused. My brain has not died out, and we're still talking on the same book. Let's go. Over the Woodward Wall is told from the perspective of a narrator who sounded in my head like a voiceover from Winnie the Pooh, or some other old animated movie, a kind of all-seeing, all-knowing eye who doesn't play an actual role in the story itself, but to be the teller. Maybe sometimes to be a little bit sassy about the things the characters do. Everything, as they describe it, is sort of long-winded and meandering, the way you might linger as you tell a story to a kid, as you try to kind of recall from memory what details come next. The effect this had on my reading was an interesting one, because usually what I think sometimes make fantasy stories the most believable is when you can feel like you're right there in there with the characters, or even right in their shoes. This one instead made me feel like I was standing next to the narrator, up in the clouds or something far off from the action, watching things play out without having a say in how they play out. And maybe that sounds strange, because even in first-person narratives, we don't have a say in what the characters do. But I don't know how else to describe it. It felt very objective, a bit impersonal, but thankfully not disengaging to me. I still felt the emotional charge of each situation and the circumstances the characters faced, and I still grew to love a lot of them pretty quickly. The story follows two main characters, two children named Avery and Zib, who are different in every way except for the fact that they are, as the book describes them, each exceptional in their own ways. The beginning of the book offers us a lot of background on their home lives and the different ways they've been raised, explaining to us how they've grown up to be such opposites and never met, in spite of living in the same town on the same block. In spite of their differences, though, the two kids, each for their own reasons, both climb the wall, which suddenly appears fantastically, blocking their paths to school, and together they embark on a journey over the wall. A little bit of a down the rabbit hole kind of entrance into the fantastic. This book begins, like many books do, by telling us all about how normal and ordinary the characters are and their homes are, just like us, really, before going on to counter this by telling exactly how their lives became less normal and therefore actually maybe a story worthy of being told. I talked last time about how the main characters, Avery and Zib, are foils or opposites to one another, but neither of them are really made out to be the good or the bad side of that opposition at all times. It creates the healthy understanding that a singular normal doesn't really exist. There isn't, or really there shouldn't be, a standard, default model of a life that we should all strive toward. We, like life itself, are full of surprises and unpredictabilities, and the normal or best way to be isn't something consistent from one circumstance to the next. We can't thrive in every situation by trying to only be one consistent thing. Sometimes adapting to change means finding a balance between the people we were and the people we have to become. Interestingly, this whole dynamic is mirrored in the description of the children's safe, ordinary town itself. Divided down the middle, the town, like the children, has yet to strike a balance between its two pieces, and so any sudden, unexpected change, like the appearance of the wall blocking the children's ways to school, calls into question just how safe and ordinary it could truly be. This is where the story begins, by throwing a wrench in the belief that these ordinary little children and their ordinary little town is ordinary at all. Without much need for encouragement, both children, no matter how different they are, understand that they have no other choice than to cross over the wall, their portal into the fantastic, and to venture into the unknown. Portals are a really common element of fantasy novels, and to be personally honest, I have a major weak spot for them. There's something so exciting and thrilling about the idea that right around the corner is a different world, one with its own nature and rules and logic, its own ups and downs and mysteries and even dangers, and people and creatures who live in a completely different way. Maybe that sounds really escapist, but I don't think it has to be. We live in a world where a whole lot of people, sooner or later, struggle to accept or even just to tolerate the fact that there are people who live their lives and experience their realities differently than the way they themselves are used to it being lived. Maybe fantasy stories, to a very small extent, can work as an important lesson in sensitivity. Like, if you can accept in fantasy and science fiction that difference and diversity is valid, or even celebrated, then what keeps you from accepting that in real life, with real people? There isn't only one way to live a life, and to be honest, I think it's become pretty clear to us, in light of our current environmental and personal well-being circumstances, that that might be a good thing. Many of our past normals haven't worked for us for a long time. It's about time we started realizing it and correcting what we do instead of just pushing it down and ignoring the fact that the way we sometimes live doesn't work for everyone around us or even for ourselves. I don't mean to exclude myself from this either, because I think to some extent most or likely all of us have been, at one time or another, guilty of intolerance or aggression against change. We shouldn't need fantasy stories in order to practice sensitivity and tolerance and implementing change, and they shouldn't stay the only way through which people come to accept difference, but they can serve as a stepping stone in that way. Fantasy can become a way through which we come to deal with our difficulties, come to terms with our anxieties and our fears, and, like Zib and Avery, to develop and grow and adapt to new situations. For the kids, it also introduces them to new pieces of knowledge about the world, about others, and even about themselves. One of the first standout moments for me in this regard came right after the children meet Quartz, the talking boulder/man who gives them the task to improbably walk the improbable road to meet the Queen of Wands. Their conversation with Quartz about the up and under, about the impossibility of talking rocks, and the similarities and differences between the ruling of multiple queens and kings versus the kids' own familiarity with elections and presidents in their own world, introduces them to the fact that it's okay that this world works a little bit differently. They each, in their own time, start to figure out what that means. how they have to change the way they act and react within it. Zib is the quicker learner of the two, but she's also impulsive, and she's spunky and strong-willed and headstrong and independent, and those things sometimes get her, and more unfortunately others as well, into trouble at times. She's more open to difference and ready to accept change, but it also means that she's less measured and less careful than Avery is, for example. Over time, they both begin to realize that life has to be lived a little bit differently in the up and under than they're both used to, but that difference is something they can and will get through and adapt to and learn from, and probably even come back better from. To get back to specifics, right after the kids' conversation with Quartz, Zib drags Avery off the road, suddenly convinced that she has the logic of the up and under figured out. As she figures it, if to find the impossible city they're told they have to follow the improbable road, then the only way to get there is to not actually literally follow the road at all. To her credit, she is right, but she drags Avery off the road into the unknown, something that puts both of them at risk. Maybe it's my own speculation, but I almost want to think that the reason they come into so much danger because of it isn't because danger was waiting for them all along, but because at this point, the two children aren't yet fully on the same wavelength. Avery is apprehensive of everything Zib does, not fully convinced that she's right about not following the road. And Zib is completely oblivious to the fact of Avery's uncertainty and discomfort. Once they begin to agree on more, to balance each other out, it seems that their situations begin to improve. At the beginning of chapter 4, page 49, we follow Avery's perspective as Zib drags him off the road and across the field, and he begins by describing his discomfort, his unhappiness, his fear, and the physical strain of running, something he's not too fond of at the best of times. But then, as he realizes, he's laughing. The passage continues, quote, "It seemed strange that he should laugh while he was being dragged across a meadow by a girl he'd only barely met, and who wasn't at all the sort of friend he was invited to bring home for lemonade and cookies. His mother would have sniffed at Zib's hair, his father would have scowled at Zib's clothes, but here they were together, having an adventure, and he knew deep down that as long as she held onto his hand, he would be just fine." Unquote. This realization, this thought process that we follow him through was really cute, and it was a really beautiful thing to me, because for the whole first section of the book, it really felt like Avery was holding his breath without even realizing it. He's always followed the rules, his every action has been measured and careful and straight-edged, and this is the first moment that he actually seems to let go and relax and be a kid, just at the wrong time, just in time to seemingly punish him for it. His foot hits a rock, and he's thrown away from Zib's hand, away from his safety, and his fear overtakes his thrill. But that moment still exists, it still happens, and it introduces him to something new and unknown and better, and to the idea that something new can be a good thing. Zib, on the other hand, has a very different experience at this point. She learns a different lesson. She sees Avery fall into the mud, and at first she struggles to understand why he can't just get himself out of the bad situation that he's just gotten himself into. For her, part of the adventure, especially her brand of solo adventure, is knowing that sometimes it brings danger, and that means sometimes getting yourself back out of danger. This whole idea, even of adventure itself, is new to Avery, though, even in his own world and his own normal, not to mention in an unknown one. What Zib learns, though, is the difference between independent adventure and having companionship on one, and realizing that sometimes what the latter means is making sacrifices and taking responsibility, especially considering it was her choice to deviate from the path in the first place. Learning this lesson for Zib is still a process, though, and we see later on when the kids meet the Bumble Bear, who asks that they give up something in order to pass him and continue on their journey. Zib gives up the shine on Avery's shoes without the real thought that that was something that might somehow matter to him. And yeah, it does seem like something small and something silly, but it's also something that for him has so far kept him grounded in his own world, in his own safety, and his own normal. To have it suddenly taken away and without his own consent makes his adjustment to the way that the up and under is more difficult. This is another point where Zib's impulsiveness and her independent way of thinking clashes with her ability to be selfless, and it keeps the two from really starting to understand each other. To be fair, Avery's naivety doesn't really set him up well either for dealing with the Bumble Bear, and so for Zib to step in is quite a necessary thing, but it's still a moment that shows that what's also necessary is for the kids to start to communicate and understand each other, or they risk everything. They risk being stuck in the up and under forever. For both of the kids as well, their adventure in the up and under is a learning experience above all else. It's a process of growth, which is something that kids go through in any story, in any life, but their specific experience displays that maybe the very best way for kids to learn is to experience things that they've never seen before, to adapt to what they don't know, and to overcome what's scary, to experience what's unknown, and learn what actions to take in reaction most of all. Even better, they do so without the guiding hand of their parents to set their habit making, and doing so in the fantastic setting. Both of them are forced to start from scratch and to make their own decisions to the very extreme. After this, going back to the ins and outs of their lives at home and making independent choices suddenly will seem like nothing at all, like the easiest choices in the world. The use of children as main characters was another part of this book that felt very classic fantasy or classic fairy tale to me, and beyond the fact that this story began as a fictional piece of educational material, essentially, that choice was very effective because of the way that it made me read their adventure, and especially their choices and their actions. I gave them a lot more patience than I would for adult characters, and it helped me to understand just how unimaginable and challenging that adventure is. On this journey, each of the children faces challenges and makes sacrifices, and as a result, they each grow and mature in their own ways. It sort of made me think of old TV shows or, old pieces of media where the characters get stuck in a video game or something like that, and one of their major questions is, if we lose our lives here, do we die in real life? What happens when we go back to real life? Can we go back to real life? This story, at its heart, is a contemporary coming-of-age story, placed into a fantastical environment. And to put it quite plainly, it was so much fun to read. I wanted to be right in there with them on their adventure. It was a little bit stressful at times too, much for the same reason. I wanted to jump in and help the kids through their trials and their fears. Being stuck on the other side of the story was sometimes frustrating for both of these reasons. For, being at the same time envious of their journey and protective of their innocence. Wanting to be their friend and their companion, but in a mom way. I hope that some of you have had that experience before. I mostly get it when I reread books that I read as a kid, and I suddenly find myself relating more to the adult characters, the parents, than to the children or the teens. The writing style and the basis for the story as a method of education really showed in the fact that it felt, for a lack of better words, a bit preachy at times. It seems like every character we meet has some type of lesson or moral for the children as they go through trial and error, and I could see it being a bit off-putting for some readers. I think if I hadn't known that the book was that kind of book within a book for middle game, it would have been off-putting for me. At times, I found the overriding sense of morality to be a bit heavy-handed, borderlining even disengaging, because to some extent I felt like it was trying to hand-feed too much to me, but it really helped me to put it back into the perspective that the style is very intentional on the part of the author. The whole point is that it feels like a lesson, and maybe even a very basic one, because that's what it's meant to be. It's very reflective of classic fantasy and fairy tale in that way, and so the style does work, and again, it is extremely intentional, but it still makes me curious to read the parent novel Middle Game, or any of Maguire's other fantasies, just to see how she handles a more modern style of the genre, and especially one intended more for a general adult audience. In general, this book was so much fun. I loved the dynamic between Zib and Avery, the way that they clash so much at the beginning, and the way that those parts of them slowly begin to balance each other out as they come to rely on each other more and more. I also loved the other characters who got attention, who were fleshed out and focused on, but especially the Crow Girl. She is so much that classic, kind and wise mentor character, not the Gandalf or the Dumbledore, but maybe the Hagrid, in the form of a small, spunky girl, and maybe sometimes as a murder of crows, who doesn't necessarily give the most decisive or perfect advice, but who knows what's what, and who makes mistakes but has a good heart, and who always wants to do what's best and right and safe with everything in her, even if it isn't always possible. She doesn't and she can't play the parent, but she can do maybe what's better, maybe even what's best of all. She gives the kids the resources and the knowledge they need to do whatever it is they need to do, and they do it all on their own. Overall, though, I think what I liked most was pretty classic of me. It wasn't the progression of the story or the plot alone, but the characters that really saved the book for me. To me, the story itself was a little bit forgettable, but I loved the personal journeys that each of the children and each of the other characters go through in the process. Reading as an adult, I loved how realistically the kids were written, very accepting of situations and willing to adapt, and the way that their journeys and growth aren't full of these huge, life-defining moments, the way that the character development of children is so often written about. It's not necessarily a bad thing for children's storylines to be big drama and big business and save the world either, but they don't have to be. It shouldn't always be on the kids to save what the adults mess up. It's funny to realize that too, because I know that that is exactly what I read for when I was younger. For the Harry Potters and the Pevensey kids and the Percy Jacksons, and later the Katniss Everdeens and the Shadowhunters. And as a kid, for me, reading about two kids who just find themselves without any real showdowns would have been boring, but it's not the way I feel now. Instead, the children's growth, even occurring in fantastic settings like this book, can follow the more simple, basic things that impact a kid, like their fears and anxieties about not being able to return home and to see their families again, but also their joys, the bliss of being young, of running in a field, of climbing an inconvenient wall in search of a solution and in the want of an adventure. As a reader, I'm happy with that. There's something comforting about stories where things get messy and scary and unpredictable, and complications happen and sacrifices are made, but that in the end they get worked out and the kids stay alive. It's comforting and relieving to know that maybe we can have adventures without it being put on us also to be the chosen one and to save the world from falling apart. It's exciting to think that those adventures aren't as far off as we sometimes think they are. And most importantly of all, maybe that we might come back from adventure better able than ever to work through the ins and outs and ups and downs of our lives on the regular. Maybe that isn't the message that Over the Woodward Wall is supposed to send out, but it's one of the messages that I took away from it, and I thought it was really lovely and such a beautiful thing from such a fun little spunky story. I really hope it was as fun for you as it was for me. I think Over the Woodward Wall was a great introduction for me to Seanan McGuire's works, as she is an author with such a prolific and huge career, and such a powerful presence on the fantasy stage. As I said, I'm definitely interested to dig into more of her works, to do a little more exploration, and not into just the sequel or sequels to this one. As for related reads and recommendations, I have a few ideas to share with you. The easy ones, of course, are the obvious. If you liked the classical feel to the narration and the story progression, then stories like The Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland are probably right up your alley. Otherwise, if you haven't read Narnia, then what are you doing? Read Narnia. I should be a little bit honest here and say that I actually didn't read Narnia until university when I read it for a class. But it's better late than never, and if you're still running late on it, get on it. It's so much fun and it's so worth the read. Another childhood or maybe teenagehood favorite of mine is Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. You might be more familiar with the 2005 movie from Studio Ghibli by the same name. The book is just as good, and for some of the same and some different reasons. For anybody unfamiliar, the story follows a plain, firstborn-in-the-family girl named Sophie Hatter, who works in her family's hat shop to eventually take it over, as firstborn daughters are of course expected to do. One evening, a witch in disguise comes into the shop and puts a curse on Sophie after she accidentally offends the witch. The curse changes her into the likes of an old woman, and she goes off in search of the help of the mysterious and infamous wizard Howl to remove the curse. To this day, it is one of my favorite middle grade fantasy stories and always one of my go-to comfort reads. If you're a fan of immersive fantasies, then I'd also recommend the Caraval series by Stephanie Garber and The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. These are also two that I feel have a very classic vibe, but in a very elegant and sophisticated and modern way, rather than a structured and moral-driven one, if that makes sense. They aren't exactly portal fantasies, but something I really loved about both of them too is the way that the fantastic seems to live right on the edge of the real. Something that can be ignored or set aside for a time, but never forever. In terms of portal fantasies, a few months ago I read The 10,000 Doors of January by Alex Harrow, which follows a girl named January, the ward of a cagey but mostly caring man named Mr. Locke, who her absent father worked for as a type of treasure hunter. After a childhood of waiting for her father to magically become what he's never been for her, consistent and reliable, and for adventure to fall into her lap, she finds a book, a journal of sorts, that speaks to her of different worlds, and she steps inside and her quiet life is never the same. It was a great read, paced and characterized quite strongly, and I really enjoyed it. I also hesitatingly recommend the Shades of Magic trilogy by V.E. Schwab, the first book being A Darker Shade of Magic. And I have to explain my hesitation here with a fear, because these books are genuinely some of my favorite books of all time ever, and I personally cannot recommend them enough. Maybe it's silly and self-conscious, but sometimes I find it the very hardest to recommend my very favorite books. Because what if people don't like them? What will they think of me? The first book follows two main characters. The first, Delilah Bard, who is all of the above. A thief, a wannabe pirate, a con woman, a liar, and an absolute gem of a character just itching for adventure. The other is Kel, the magical adopted son of royalty. He has the power to walk between different dimensions, specifically between 4 versions of the same London, though one of the 4 is out of commission, and he's been given the task to deliver messages and items from one London to the next, serving as a type of, as I like to refer to him, as a magic mailman. One evening, he comes across a dangerous piece of magic, something escaped from the London that nobody talks about, and he's meant to return it to its proper home, but before he gets the chance, it's stolen from him, picked from his pocket by none other than Lila Bard. After tracking her down, Kel convinces her to give it back, on her one condition, that she gets in on the adventure too. Again, it's a trilogy, and high fantasy, and definitely an undertaking, but I love those books. Victoria Schwab, in general, has a fantastic body of works, and she writes everything from middle grade to adult, and she's one of my all-time favorite authors. So, for today, I'm going to leave you here. I hope Over the Woodward Wall was a fun read for you, if you got the chance to pick it up. If not, then thank you so much for sticking it out with me this month, and especially for this long-winded chat. Thank you so much again for listening this month, and I hope you take good care until next time when we come back, which won't be far off, to announce our read for October. Happy reading! The Off the Shelf podcast is a proud member of the Ordinary Podcasting Network. To learn more about this podcast or the network, please visit ordinarypodcast.com. Finally, thank you for listening, and if you haven't already, please subscribe or leave us a comment. Thank you so much, and take care.